Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I welcome back to the show Mr. Mike Swanson to continue our conversation about the military-industrial complex and its origins. Mr. Swanson is the author of The War State, The Cold War Origins of the Military-Industrial Complex and the Power Elite, 1945 to 1963. And he is the founder of Wall Street Window. You can follow his work at thewarstate.com and at wallstreetwindow.com. You can find him on Facebook under The War State. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/complex-2. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to talk with you.
Well, thanks for joining me again. So there will probably be some overlap between this conversation and part one of our conversation, but there are some topics that are just so important and so worth discussing and rehashing. And to start, there will definitely be some overlap because I want to bring people up to speed if they haven't heard part one yet. So can you give a brief overview of your book, The War State, and an overview of what the military-industrial complex is?
Yeah, well, that's a great question to start out. It sounds like a simple question, but it's a little complicated and ambiguous for most people. I've got a good friend of mine that listens to Rush Limbaugh every single day and is a conservative. I'm fairly conservative myself, but we had a conversation. He didn't even know what the military-industrial complex was or meant. I told him I wrote a book on it, and he didn't even know what it was. And he's no dummy. So it's something that is a real important part of the life of our country, our economy even, and yet to most people, it's actually hidden if you're not in the military service, if you don't have family in the military, and frankly, nowadays most people don't. Even though the Defense Department employs more people than anyone on the planet, over 3 million people, that's still 3 million people out of a very large population of the United States. And that kind of gives you an idea of the dichotomy there. It's the biggest employer, yet it's still, a fraction of the overall population. But my father was a colonel in the Army. My grandfather, he served in World War II. And the way I think about my own life, I'm about 41 right now, is that my parents' generation grew up in the 1940s. And during World War II, and then we had the Cold War. I was young enough to remember the Cold War vividly in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and then George Bush, the senior, when the Berlin Wall fell. But the arms race was a real thing. I was scared of that. There are Twilight Zone episodes about it, and so forth. And today, all that history is kind of seems to be gone, and now we're in the war of terror. However, what I think is real critical, that kind of was one of the reasons I wrote this book, is that the history of our country really took a dramatic change during World War II and with the Cold War. That is something that we today take for granted and don't even think about, don't even realize. Most people. And the change is that we became a country that has a permanent military, not only simply has a standing army all the time, which the founding fathers were very wary of having, but we have one of the largest and most powerful, definitely, militaries ever known in human history. Before World War II, the U.S. Army consisted of no more than 100,000 people, barely had any tanks. The Air Force hardly even existed. And it was just something that was barely, there, really. Just a small fraction of the military budget, which is hard for people to imagine, especially when you think, well, we had big wars. We had World War I, we had the Civil War, the war in the Philippines. We sent troops to Nicaragua in the 1920s. But after all those wars, the country demobilized. And after World War II, we did not do that. We kept the standing army. We kept all the airplanes we built even more of them, and so forth. So that was something new in American history. And what that created was the so-called military industrial complex, which is the whole defense industry that, builds all the weapons, the tanks, the airplanes, the aircraft carriers, and on and on and on, which is such a big component of our economy today. And it's linked in with what we talked about last time, what political scientists call an iron triangle, which is a political science concept that says that basically in Washington D.C. you've got lobbyists in an industry linked with politicians, linked with bureaucrats, which in the case of the military are the generals, and now the whole intelligence industry, the homeland security industry, and so forth. And these form a block of influence that has their own interests to keep themselves going and keep themselves important and so forth. But one of the things I really want to say is that, to repeat, this came into being really with my parents' generation, and I grew up in this. You grew up in this. We just take it for granted. We turn on our television set, watch a baseball game. You see the Navy flyovers and think, well, that's just the way it always is. But in the back of my mind, I wonder, all empires on, and this is all part of an empire. Having bases all over the world, being engaged in nonstop conflict, and when I was younger, people wouldn't want to say that, but today, people boast that that's the case and think advocate for it. It openly say we got an empire. But what I wonder about is that to understand where the country might be going, you have to think, well, maybe this isn't necessarily a permanent thing. I can't predict the future, but nothing lasts forever. But the key thing is that this is a new system that really started with our parents' generation, and the country was different, and therefore it may not exist by the time we pass away or get really old, or things go into something else. It's hard to say.
And what was so different about World War II that would produce such a major change in the in the structure of the army, and in having a standing army, and in creating this military-industrial complex soon after?
Well, it wasn't actually the World War II itself. We defeated or helped defeat Japan and Germany, and we did the same thing in World War One. We helped defeat Germany in that war too. We had the same basic alliances, so roughly Russia and the Soviet Union in World War II. What was different was what came after. In the way the war ended, in particular, the way World War II ended was we dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, which was it was a brand new weapon, and it was a weapon that changed the course of history because it held the potential to destroy the entire world if enough of them were dropped. One of them wiped out an entire city. So it was a shocking weapon. The people who developed the weapon, Robert Oppenheimer, Einstein, whose theories were used to do it, worried about what the consequences of the weapon would be. And after the war was over, we were the only country that had the atomic bomb, and we had what was going to be a tense relationship with the Soviet Union. They had a communist system of government. They had taken control over Eastern Europe. They defeated Germany, but they conquered and held Poland, Czechoslovakia, the countries east of Germany, and half of Germany itself. And they did this consciously with the idea that they wanted to protect themselves from being invaded again by another Western power, by Germany, as they've done it multiple times throughout history. But a Cold War began because we dropped the atomic bomb. They didn't have the atomic bomb, and other countries took that as the threatening thing. We had sole possession of this weapon, And the Soviet Union's response to that was to construct their own weapon. It took them a couple years to do it, but when Truman dropped the atomic bomb, within a couple weeks, he was having a press conference, and the reporters asked him, "Are you going to build any more?" And he said, "Yes, the arms race is on." So the Cold War was tied up with this atomic arms race. Now, the funny thing about it, though, is for the first 2 decades of the Cold War, just about, there wasn't really much of an arms race. We had an overwhelming advantage against the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, they hardly had any atomic weapons that could reach the United States. They just had a handful of bombers, while we had hundreds of bombers by the mid 1950s. By 1960, they had four nuclear missiles that could reach the continental United States, and that was just about all they had. It wasn't really till 1965 that they reached a parity with the United States, where we couldn't no longer attack them without likely being wiped out. And China also became an enemy of the United States. They became communist a couple years after World War II and joined the Soviet Union in an uneasy alliance together, but they didn't develop a nuclear weapon until 1965. The funny thing about that, though, is in the 1950s, the American people didn't know these facts. They didn't know that we were so far ahead, and they lived in fear that we could be wiped out at any moment in an atomic strike. Children were shown cartoons that dramatized a sudden nuclear war, and you'd have to drop under your desk and try to hide to escape the blast. And that's the kind of environment I grew up as a kid too. And the funny thing is, I went to college. I got a master's degree in history. I was in a doctoral program for a year or two and dropped out, went into business. But I had some professors who were still are actually leading historians of the Cold War. Took courses with them. I've read much of the scholarship while I was in college. This is in the late 90s. And the funny thing is, I didn't know these facts about the depth of how far ahead we were in the arms race, which really meant we really didn't suffer or didn't face imminent threat like people thought they were. So that's one thing about history. As time goes on, more information gets released. There's, historians dig and find out more information, and a greater understanding is made over time. So that's kind of what also is in my book. Is I put that information in there, and I was really shocked when I found out about that.
Yeah, this so-called missile gap wasn't exactly what people thought it was at the time.
No, it wasn't a missile gap at all. We were, in fact, ahead of it. And that fact led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happened was John Kennedy ran for president and said that we had a missile gap. He was given or told that by basically lobbyists in the defense industry, people in think tanks, some people, generals or Air Force generals and whatnot. So he may have believed it, but once he became president, within 6 months or so, he found out that this was totally false. His Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, studied the situation, and the CIA launched its first spy satellite that was able to go over the entire planet and survey the Soviet Union. Up until then, we were flying U-2 planes over the Soviet Union, taking pictures. And the funny thing is, they saw this launching pad of 4 rockets on it, no more launching pads. They knew there were 4 missiles there for sure. And they used the excuse that, well, there's sometimes there's clouds over parts of the Soviet Union, so there could be more hidden that we just don't know about, to justify the possible missile gap. Is just basically made up. But what happened was, when they launched the Corona satellite and surveyed the whole place all at one time, they saw the reality. Nothing was there but these 4 missiles in 1960 and 1961. And what happened was, Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, his economy, because the Soviet system is just really inefficient, and people were so far behind compared to living standards in the United States that he wanted to, in his mind, reinvest, try to improve living conditions. In order to do that, he didn't want the military spending to go out of control in his country. He wanted to try to limit it. So he claimed that he had all these nuclear weapons with the idea that he could bluff the West and just have a couple, and that would be enough to intimidate the rest of the world. And it worked in the media. Didn't necessarily work with the leaders of the United States, but it certainly worked in it fooled the entire rest of the world. People believed him when he would say things like, "I'm making nuclear rockets like we're making sausages," and so forth. But what happened was, when McNamara gave Kennedy this information about what the reality of the missile gap is, McNamara's deputy, Roswell Gilpatrick, gave a press conference and laid this out and said, "We got this many missiles, the Russians barely have anything, and we're so far ahead, and we don't face any threat." And the reason he was doing this was to stop further pressure for the defense industry to build more missiles. Kennedy also wanted to try to limit a little bit of this defense spending, and a lot of it was driven by fear of this missile gap. So that's what happened. And by making these statements, it humiliated Khrushchev and embarrassed him in the Soviet Union, and it revealed, although the general public didn't understand this, it did reveal to people who were paying attention the reality of the situation, that the Soviets were so far behind. And Khrushchev tried to respond to that by sticking missiles in Cuba that could reach the United States. The big problem they had was they had nuclear missiles in East Germany that could reach England and France, but only a handful that could reach the U.S. They didn't develop rockets that were really efficient enough, or that could be built at enough of a pace that could reach the States. So they just stuck some of these things in Cuba with the idea that they're going to reveal them to the world and try to negotiate the arms race and try to get the United States to recognize Cuba and do other things that the Soviets wanted. And that was his plan. And of course, it totally backfired on him. And Kennedy responded by threatening to attack unless he withdrew the missiles, essentially, and created a very tense situation that lasted 7 days. Actually longer than that, close, more like 13 days. But that was the Cold War, the worst, one of the worst parts, or most dangerous moments of the Cold War, is this Cuban Missile Crisis.
And how did the NSC 68 document from 1950 and the establishment of the containment policy by the United States towards communism, how did that factor into the arms race and to the development of the military-industrial complex?
Well, they're two separate things. The containment policy really started with a telegram that a diplomat, our diplomat to the Soviet Union, George Kennan, right after World War II was coming to an end, he sent a telegram back to the United States, and it circulated all throughout the State Department and was passed around all over the place. And it provided people inside the government understanding of what this Cold War is and how to combat the Soviet Union. Now, what he claimed was that the Soviet system itself was very brittle and inefficient and would eventually collapse in time due to those facts. And it wasn't necessarily an extremely dire threat that was going to kill everyone, but it had to be contained nonetheless to prevent it from spreading its influence outside of the Eastern Bloc, which is the Eastern Europe that they had conquered. So what he wanted to do is just keep the Soviet Union within its borders, pressure it diplomatically with foreign aid, with covert activities, which became the CIA, and so forth, and just not let them expand their power. And he thought, well, within decades, we would win the Cold War. That policy was implemented by Harry Truman. He gave a famous speech, which became known as the Truman Doctrine to Congress, in which what happened was Greece, after World War II, and Italy both were in economic trouble. All of Europe was, but Greece and Italy also had communist parties that looked like they could win elections. During the fight against the Nazis, these communists were acting as partisans and rebels against the Germans. So they had a lot of popularity in these two countries. And Harry Truman said this was a dire threat, that if these parties took over, it would represent Soviet expansion, and we had to stop it. So he had us send, or he had the United States send aid, and covert agents help to work to influence the elections and so forth. These people later became figures in the CIA, James Angleton, Frank Wisner, but that's another story. So that was an example of the containment doctrine in action. Then what happened was, by 1950, 1951, as the years went by, there was actually a little bit of demobilization going on with the U.S. Army and the defense spending. Truman didn't really want an out-of-the-control arms race, despite making that statement within weeks after dropping the atomic bomb. He came to understand at that time that the Soviets were so far behind that they weren't likely to catch up with us as long as we maintained the levels of spending we were at. But there was still lots of lobbyists and lots of pressure to do more, so we could maintain that advantage for certain. That's what people in the government wanted, in the Air Force and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But also elements of the defense industry wanted more spending, in particular the aircraft industry. There's a book called The War Scare that actually describes this. A lot of the airplane companies have become dependent on the defense spending, and they risk going under if it wasn't accelerated. So they lobbied to get more spending and so forth. And in 1950-51, there was a person in the State Department named Paul Nitze, who was working on behalf of Dean Acheson, who is the Secretary of State. And these were very hawkish people who wanted to really take the Cold War to another level beyond containment. And he drew up a document called NSC 68, which exaggerated the abilities of the Soviet Union to increase its own defense spending. It predicted that the Soviet Union would actually be able to attack the United States with nuclear weapons within 5 years. And these estimates are completely made up. In fact, I document in my book that Paul Nitze was contacting generals in Europe and asking them essentially to exaggerate their estimates of Soviet capabilities so he could put it in the report. But the important thing was what the report concluded, and that was that the Soviet Union was a dangerous expansionary power, that it was getting itself in a position to potentially overrun Europe, attack the United States even, unless we accelerate defense spending and stop them from ever trying to catch up. So that's what the document advocated. But then it also called for not simply containing the Soviet Union, but basically a doctrine of the phrase, two words it used in the report, was world order. What that meant was that any country in the world needed to be not simply independent of the Soviet Union, but an ally of the United States that wasn't in its orbit. So some countries that may decide to be neutral would need to therefore be overthrown covertly. Would be the best way to do it. They didn't want to just invade everyone. So that's what the document asserted. And Truman didn't want to sign it when he first saw it, but the Korean War started, more pressures emanated, and Nitze and Acheson had actually lobbied all sorts of people within the State Department and inside the bureaucracy to pressure for this too, and kind of caught Truman off guard and the Secretary of Defense off guard. Truman's Secretary of Defense also was against signing this, but they just kind of outmaneuvered him, and Truman signed it. He could have thought that he would just ignore it, but he signed the thing nonetheless. And this really became the guiding document for the Cold War, one of the most important documents signed after World War II, besides the Congressional Act that created the Department of Defense and the CIA and so forth. The National Security Act of 1946 is what that is called. But I view this as one of the founding documents of the Cold War. If someone wants to understand what the United States government was thinking during the Cold War years, this is the document to read. The funny thing is, after 9/11, there was a similar document of importance signed by George Bush. I think it's called National Security Strategy of the United States, but it was signed a few weeks or months after 9/11, and it's similar in length and probably similar in importance, and makes also similar arguments. Just basically asserts that the Soviet Union, it doesn't know about the Soviet Union, but it basically asserts that we need to control and dominate the rest of the world to prevent anyone else from doing it, to prevent rogue states from doing something bad, using weapons of mass destruction or whatnot. So that was one rationale for invading Iraq. Back in the 50s, we weren't invading all these countries. Instead, what we're doing was using the CIA to overthrow countries we did not like. We did that in Guatemala in 1954 and also Iran, but also in some other places not so well known, such as Laos. We overthrew the government of Laos because it wanted to be neutral around 1960, and also supported the government, or created essentially the government in South Vietnam in in the mid 1950s after the communists in Vietnam defeated the French, who had it as a former colony. They negotiated splitting that country in half, but we became part of the negotiations and made South Vietnam into a client state, helped create the government there.
Yeah, so why was the CIA created? And you've touched a little bit on their legacy, but can you expound on that a little bit more and explain a little more of just how critical the establishment of the CIA has been to the growth and beginning stages of the military-industrial complex?
Well, the CIA, it's interesting because back in the 1940s, or really from World War, really, let's see if we can divide this. If you think about today, the way you think of the CIA, you turn on the TV and it's kind of like a just giant bureaucracy. And you can get a job there if you want to, if you're out of college or if they accept you, and thousands and thousands of employees and so forth. But the intelligence business during and before World War II was much different, even throughout human history. It, generally speaking, was a few people in the intelligence world, not like tens of thousands of people. And they would have special relationships. So if you think about the Civil War, let's say, you didn't have this giant spy bureaucracy. Instead, the Union Army of the North may have a couple lawyers or bankers or some women in the South giving them information, just a handful of people that were, for whatever personal reason, devoted to the cause of the Union. The Confederacy was the same way, and that's kind of how history worked. But in World War I, things started to shift a little bit because a couple people in the military decided that they wanted to start to really keep better track of things, keep more records of potential subversives and people. You had J. Edgar Hoover create a whole division of the FBI that was doing this. Then he became head of the FBI out of fear of subversive people in the United States. And then when World War II happened, the military formed something called the Office of Strategic Services. which was to do spy work and also try to help partisans that were in occupied Europe. And again, this was really run by people, a small handful of people that were basically Wall Street lawyers. The best example is Alan Dulles, who worked for a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, which had clients of lots of businesses in Germany before the war, lots of American businesses that were doing business in Germany, and banks were lending loans to the Germans. So he had lots of contacts with people in Germany. And once the war got going, he moved to Switzerland and set up shop in Vienna there, and just would sit there every day in his house, apartment, and people would come in there and give him information, former business associates, and then soon it would be German people that were, giving him information. People, even the SS, that could see that the war was shifting in directions that would get them in trouble, and thought, well, if I give the U.S. information, then they'll give me a good break when the war's over, and that's basically what happened. But the point I want to make is it was really a personal type hands-on thing of people that already had connections that would become at the top of the spy agency, the OSS, and the head of it was a guy named William Donovan, who is also a Wall Street lawyer. So it was really headed by these Wall Street guys. And then when the war was winding down, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. And Harry Truman himself said he didn't really care for spies, and he didn't want the United States to have anything resembling a Gestapo like the Nazis had. He actually told someone that. So what his vision was he would like to see a simple intelligence unit in the government to prevent something like what happened at Pearl Harbor. They want to make sure someone's analyzing all the information and not missing anything. Well, William Donovan and Alan Dulles, they had a vision of keeping the OSS going in another fashion, or making it even more important. They wanted to send spies into Eastern Europe, use it all over the world to influence countries, which is what ended up happening. So they lobbied to create the CIA. They actually failed at first, and Harry Truman just basically swept them to the side. But then when the situation in Italy and Greece happened, which I talked about a little earlier, they needed some sort of intelligence activity. They wanted someone to go to these countries and hand people money to run for office or support candidates that they wanted to win and influence the elections. And they needed real spies. So they set up a small division of the State Department to do that. Frank Wisner, who had been associated with Alan Dulles during World War II in Eastern Europe, he headed this up, and he helped run these operations in Italy and Greece. And then when he created more operations, now he was running people into Eastern Europe to try to find out what was going on there. The German intelligence, or a part of the German intelligence apparatus during the war that was aimed at the Soviet Union, it actually continued to exist in West Germany with the aid of Alan Dulles and people in our intelligence community. So there are already things being set up. And when the National Security Act of 1946 was passed, that put into law and finally authorized the creation of the CIA and gave it the ability to do things at the permission of the president overseas in covert activities and sabotage and propaganda. That's the wording of the bill. When the bill was actually passed, this was merely a couple paragraphs in it. Most of the bill was devoted to creating the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff structure, formalizing it, creating the Air Force, in creating the Department of Defense. There wasn't even something called the Department of Defense until that act. It was called the War Department. So a lot of when the bill was passed, a lot of the controversy in Congress was about, are we going to create an Air Force? The Navy didn't want one. The Army didn't want one. What about the Marine Corps? Is it just going to disappear and so forth, with different interests lobbying for these things? And the CIA element of the bill was pretty much ignored and not thought about. And then it was passed, and the CIA became what we saw it become in the 1950s. And it's had a long history. It's changed, frankly, over the years. It's had what's the way to put it? Moments of institutional power, and then times where it's been discredited, and it really isn't the institution is of importance today as it was in the 50s and in the early 60s. In the 1970s, there were a lot of scandals involving the CIA that were exposed. Things such as assassinating foreign leaders, spying on American citizens, spying on the anti-war movement, doing even experiments on American citizens of acid and LSD and all kinds of things that just kind of ruined its reputation. And the activities of the 50s and 60s, a lot of them were just exposed in the 70s. And then today, with the war on terror, the CIA does have a lot to do with the drone strikes, but it is primarily an intelligence collecting and analyzing institution, and a lot of the covert activities are done really in the Defense Department. And it's also one of the reasons why this has changed, which I actually think is really important for what our empire, let's call it, has become, is in the 1950s, in Greece and in Italy, and I mentioned Iran, the CIA basically had a couple people that would go in these countries and give people money, and that would be enough to overthrow government. In Iran, there was Mossadegh became the prime minister, and he wanted to nationalize the oil interests in Iran, and England didn't want to do it. Anyway, to make a long story short, we sent one CIA agent, one person over there, and he spent about $5 million in bribes and got people in the military to support an overthrow of Mossadegh. And we brought in the former Shah of Iran to come back. He was young back then to take control. And we funded street demonstrations to make it look like there's a popular revolt going on. And it just took about $5 million. Today, though, we don't have the ability to do that. We could do that in Guatemala. We could do that in Brazil, different countries in Latin America. But today, you're not going to walk into a country and just spend $5 million and bribe people, because these countries are a lot more advanced than they were back then. Even if there are problems of poverty and whatever, the governments are not what they're not run by a handful of people anymore. So the CIA just can't do the type of things it did back in its early years. So times are just different. I think that that's also means that today the American empire is also doesn't have the type of influence or control that we could have back then either. That today we have to rely so much more on the drone strike or the troops on the ground, which I think is actually a sign of a weaker empire than we had in the 1950s and mid 60s.
Yeah, so one more topic I want to look at before we wrap up, and we've discussed this some already, but I think it's so important to understanding the military-industrial complex and how it got started. And that's the emergence of two quote-unquote superpowers after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, and the declining influence of some of the other powers up to that point, the United Kingdom and France, and the end of European colonialism. Now, European colonialism still existed in smaller forms for several decades after that period, but in the years after World War II, we really started seeing European colonialism start to wind down, and we saw some major moves away from that. So what sorts of power vacuums were created by the end of European colonialism, and how did the emergence of these two superpowers and the declining influence of some of the previous world powers contribute to the establishment of the military-industrial complex and the arms race that went along with it?
Well, for us, for Americans, looking back on these years, the most vivid example is, of course, Vietnam, because that was a French colony, and the French couldn't hold it after World War II. But interestingly enough, Ho Chi Minh, he was a communist nationalist, and he approached the United States right after the war, the months after the war, sent a letter to President Truman saying he wanted to be our ally, but we turned our back on him and rejected the idea. Really, people in the State Department did that. Interesting enough, there are OSS agents left over from World War II that were helping Ho Chi Minh during the war and were supporting him in the months after in sending these letters. But what happened was,
And they had the Japanese as a common enemy during the war.
yeah, exactly. So that's what was going on. Ho Chi Minh was fighting the Japanese, and we had these spy OSS agents right on the border in China helping him or talking with him because they were the only people doing it. But anyway, how this relates to the Cold War, and then I'll talk about other places too. But this, the thing is, we supported the French, and the question is why? Why do we do that? And the reason was that the French basically kind of threatened some people in the United States. I think it was the ambassador to France. I can't remember exactly who they told this to, but basically they said, look, we want to hold the colony. If you don't let us hold the colony, we might start working with the Soviet Union. So help us hold the colony, give us money and aid. So that's what happened. We turned our back on Ho Chi Minh and helped the French out because we wanted to maintain them as allies. So that kind of thing happened in other places in Africa for a period of time. Immediately after World War II in the 1950s, where these countries still remained as colonies or quasi-colonies of the West. And we were supporting that because we didn't want to lose Portugal and Spain and England as our allies either. Now, Kennedy is an interesting figure because he started to see that this was unsustainable because these countries were going to want to be free. They had leaders that weren't necessarily communists, but they're more nationalist. And nationalism was kind of sweeping the world at the time. Unlike today, it's so much of the Middle East is tied up in religion. But back in the 50s, you had Nasser, who took power in Egypt as a nationalist leader. And these nationalist leaders' ideas were, I want to build a strong state, get aid from either the Soviets or the Americans. I'll play them off one another to get as much money as I can, and I'll assert myself and try to be independent. And that's kind of what Nasser was doing in Egypt. But there are a whole host of other countries in Africa that were kind of playing this game too. And the United States, though, really for the most part had the upper hand. The Soviets in Africa only had real influence in Ethiopia and Somalia and in the 1970s in Angola. And there are a couple places where the leaders were more like trying to play both sides, and we would overthrow them or even sanction their murder. The most famous instance of that is Patrice Lumumba, who was an elected leader of the Congo. It was a colony that was being split away from Portugal, and this guy was perceived to be shaky in the CIA by people in the CIA, and Dwight Eisenhower sanctioned his murder in a meeting, basically called for his assassination. Didn't use that word, but he basically, said, I wouldn't mind seeing him go away. And so he was killed within a week or two after Kennedy was elected. But that's kind of the state of the world after World War II. And the interesting thing is almost the entire continent of Africa had been a colony to somebody. And by around 1970, that had all changed. Almost every country there was independent by then. So it is a giant sea shift, but nationalism was the primary ideology of the people in these countries. Today, that's not really the case in the enemies of the United States. They're not necessarily people with the idea that I want to build a great modern country. They're more like these ISIS people, or they seem to be using religion as their primary ideology. So it's a things change over time.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. And I want to take a look at where we are right now and see what changes might be on the horizon, because we've really seen this shift over the decades, and it's been sped up since World War II, but it's gone on even longer than that, of the U.S. going from something resembling a republic to something much more resembling an empire. What changes could bring that to an end and make the U.S. back into something more closely resembling a republic again?
Well, it's an interesting question. I see two potential things that could change the way things the way things are, the type of political structure that we've grown up in, or the power of the military-industrial complex and the existence of this empire. The first is unfortunate, and that's bankruptcy of the United States due to the expense of all this. The economy has had this cycle of boom and bust, and we haven't had great economic growth since 2008, and that could be a whole topic for another show. But the biggest problem is growing government debt. Is it sustainable, and so forth? And it may not be, and we could go into some sort of financial crisis. I don't think it would be the end of the world if it happened. It wouldn't be good for most people for a couple of years, but the end result would cause people to want to reconsider what's going on and force the government to cut back expenses. It would create a completely different global geopolitical environment, because China at the same time is rising as a growing economy. And Russia also has the potential to do the same. So, and you have Brazil growing, India growing. So we have the emergence of more growing modern economies that can compete with a unipolar world. So that may all change too by the end of our lifetime, even without the economy in the United States turning sour due to financial problems. But that would speed up a process that might take 100 years and make it take 10. The other thing would be more understanding and realization among people of what's going on and what costs they do bear for all this, because, as I mentioned before, most people are simply oblivious to the reality of the situation. Like I said, I have a friend, well educated, and listens to Rush Limbaugh every day, but he doesn't even know what the military industrial complex is. Americans really don't have any conception that this costs so much money. It makes up over half of the entire federal budget. So it's a big cause for the high taxes we pay, the high or the lack of real economic growth, and the melees the country seems to be in. And of course, there's the cost that people bear that have to fight in these wars. And, we have seen people question that in this election with the rise of Donald Trump in the Republican primaries in South Carolina, in Virginia. In fact, the same thing happened, where in both these places he got a majority of votes among veterans and military personnel, who I would assume are kind of, disgusted, or I'm not sure what the right description is, but they voted for him over the people that are more advocating aggressive interventions, such as Bush or Rubio. Even though that's been a couple months ago, I do think that is an indication of some change. So people may simply be starting to question what's going on, want a better foreign policy. People, I think, have a feeling that when we go to Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya to a certain extent, that we're spending money on these people and wasting our resources, and some Americans have to pay a price of being crippled or killed. And is the price worth paying? Some people are asking that question. So if enough people ask that question, that also can change things. And people, a small number of people, more libertarian-oriented people, are also concerned about what is the cost to the civil liberties that we were born with, that are eroding to a certain extent. The NSA spying scandal a couple years ago, the best example of that, most apparent example. So, I think everybody really in the United States is uncomfortable with the way the political situation is. They aren't really happy with the way the economy is. That's why Trump has done so well. It's also why Sanders has done so well with Democrats. Even though he lost, it's still something to see, a challenger do that well against Clinton, who was supposed to be a shoo-in. So there is disgruntlement out there. I think it's a question of where does it go in the next couple of years. So I think we're going to see interesting times.
Yes, we will, and it'll be interesting to follow, regardless of who becomes president, regardless of how much it matters who becomes president and how different they are or are not. It will definitely be interesting to follow. But I mentioned at the beginning of the show, of course, some ways that people can follow your work, and let's discuss that again very quickly. So what are the best ways to follow your work, and can you talk a little bit about Wall Street Window?
Yeah, well, I've got two websites. The Wall Street Window is a financial website. I write a financial newsletter and talk about, what I'm investing in. Primarily today, it's gold and commodities. So if they're interested in that, then go there. The other website is thewarstate.com, which is the title of the book. And on that website, I'm basically just writing blog posts a couple times a week on these topics and whatever is in the news related to them. And there's also a Facebook page, The War State. If people like Facebook, they can go there. And I also try to post in there interesting news articles I see a couple times a day on this topic too.
Okay, great. Well, I want to encourage everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/complex-2, and that is the show notes page for this episode. And of course, there will be multiple links to the book that we've been discussing, The War State, as well as the War State Facebook page and thewarstate.com and wallstreetwindow.com, and a few books that we've discussed over the course of both parts, as well as a link to part one and a link to another related episode or two. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/complex-2 is the place to go for resources and articles and books and links related to this episode. And I want to encourage everybody, while they're on our website, to sign up for our email list. You will not get spammed or anything like that, but it is a great way to stay up to date with what's going on with the show. And also to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes or Stitcher or the podcatcher of your choice to make sure that you never miss an episode. And Mike, thanks for joining me again and hashing out a little more of what's in the book. There's so many important topics covered in there, and I felt like one conversation was not sufficient to do the book and to do this topic justice. So thanks for joining me again so we could look at a few more of the issues you discuss.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great. It's fun.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.